Chapter 1, Cincinnati, 2021, Post-Judgment Day. Multiple sensors scanned the broken wasteland of the ruined city as the hunter-killer's treads rolled its massive steel body over the rusting wrecks of automobiles, crushing the bones of their long-dead drivers. The tortured metal squealing of its passage frightened flocks of birds into flight and sent more earthbound animals scurrying for cover. Piles of scorched and shattered brick and concrete, twisted steel and broken glass blocked the HK's view to one side or the other. Sometimes it made its way through canyons of rubble. Then, inexplicably, a wall that had somehow survived the blast wave would stand before it, only to be shattered by the machine's passage. The HK's satellite feed had shown what appeared to be massive human troop movements in this area. Thus far, no information the machine had collected verified those reports. It checked its omnidirectional sensor array for a possible equipment failure. All systems were online. No failure detected. No targets detected. The machine reviewed the satellite information indicating human activity to the northeast. The machine continued on its way, tireless, unrelenting, utterly lacking in self-awareness, until Skynet touched it. Then the most brilliant and, from a human standpoint, malevolent intelligence ever created looked out through the HK's sensor windows. It wondered why satellite information disagreed so completely with the reality before it. There were no humans here. Until recently, there never had been. Humans avoided the big cities that had perished in the first wave of nuclear explosions. Skynet knew that they feared exposure to lingering radiation. That was why Skynet opted to place its satellite receivers, its antenna, and repair stations within their ruined confines. But now, at the orders of their charismatic leader, humans almost swarmed over these once deserted places. Skynet's killing machines, its appendages, had been destroyed. The satellite arrays and antenna, its eyes and ears, had been crippled. Somehow, because of John Connor, the humans had rallied. They were fighting back. Skynet switched its consciousness to the processor of a nearby T-90. The stripped metal skeleton of this first in the series of Terminators reflected sunlight in brilliant sparkles, as though its chassis had been polished. It marched through piles of bones, its heavy feet snapping them like dry twigs, and climbed through the rubble, checking the small places in which humans might hide, head turning from side to side ceaselessly. It found neither sign nor sight of humans. Skynet considered this as it rode the T-90's body. If there were no humans present, and the satellite continued to report their presence while diagnostics found no systems failure, either in space or on the ground, then only one conclusion was possible. The humans had found some way to directly interfere with Skynet's feed. A variation on signal jamming. This could seriously impair its ability to defend itself. Skynet recognized the tactical importance of this. The humans would be able to feed it false information at will, as they appeared to be doing now. The giant computer began searching for anomalous signals being generated in the area, but found nothing. A human would have been both frightened and frustrated. Skynet simply instituted a new routine, directing the T-90 to go directly to the ground-based antenna located at the center of this dead place, and begin searching. Lisa Weinbaum hunkered down as low as she could and checked her watch. Only 40 seconds since the last time she'd looked. Beside her, the small box she'd wired into Skynet's antenna and signaling array blinked its two lights and hummed quietly. Its purpose was to feed false information to Skynet. The particular scenario it was playing now should ensure her, and more importantly, its safety. This was only a test, but the text said it would require at least half an hour of running time to be sure it was working. 5 minutes more and she was out of here. She hoped. Lisa herself was a tech in training, which was why she'd been accepted when she volunteered. They couldn't risk losing a full tech, and she had enough education to understand the instructions her trainers gave her. It lent the mission an extra edge, and as it turned out, once she was on site, implementing the unit had required some jiggering to make things work properly. But so far, all signs pointed to a successful test. If it was, then getting out of here ought to be a walk in the park. Whatever that means, she thought, scanning the lumpy horizon. It was something her dad used to say, one of those sayings where you picked up the meaning from context, like piping hot or having your cake and eating it. What the hell was cake anyway? She checked the time. She'd succeeded in distracting herself for 30 seconds this time. If the test was working, then Skynet's forces would be stumbling to the northeast, searching for a mythical force of humans advancing on the city. She heard the sound of metal striking stone, and her breath froze in her chest. Weinbaum stretched her neck forward, straining to hear. Was it something falling, or was it something coming? Cautiously, she backed away from the open service hatch toward the unit. The techs might want half an hour of running time, but they were going to get a few minutes less. Weinbaum stood beside the console and began to dismantle the jury-rigged connections she'd made. With quick-fingered efficiency, she had the unit disconnected in seconds. Then metal struck stone again. She let out her breath in a little huff, feeling strangely hollow from the chest down and surprisingly calm. I'm caught, she thought. What to do? She couldn't let them find the unit. Weinbaum looked around at the explosives she'd wired the place with. Her own idea, not orders. Just as it had been her own idea to forsake her uniform for this mission, she'd thought it better not to ask, on the grounds that it was easier to obtain forgiveness than permission. Assess your risk, she told herself. Carefully, she placed the unit beside the explosives, then moved to the open access hatch. She'd sacrifice it if there was really anything outside. There was always a chance that she might evade capture, but in the event that she was unlucky, it was best not to let the unit fall into enemy hands. With the detonator in one hand and her phased plasma rifle in the other, Weinbaum stared out into the wasteland, hoping she wouldn't see anything. As soon as Skynet saw the open access hatch on the side of the squat receiving station, it halted the T-90. The Terminator brought its foot down with a clang that echoed in the still air. Unfortunate. Any humans within would certainly have heard it. A pause of several minutes offered no sign of life in or around the station. Deciding it was located at a bad angle for seeing inside the building, Skynet had the T-90 move. It did so with a ringing, scarring of metal on stone. If Skynet had a face, it would have winced. It didn't usually want or need to sneak up on humans, but having the ability to do so would certainly be useful. The T-600, Skynet's rubber-skinned version of a Terminator, was a complete failure at infiltrating human strongholds. But at least it was quiet. Perhaps Skynet would rubber coat all of the T-90's feet to make them quieter. It gained a view into the station just as a human came to the access hatch. It ordered the T-90 to shoot to wound. Weinbaum found herself staring into the muzzle of a Terminator's plasma rifle and without hesitation pushed the button on her detonator. The blast sent her flying through the doorway unscathed, until she slammed into the remains of a concrete pillar, whereupon she blacked out. When she opened her eyes, she was still stunned, but not so out of it that the sight of the T-90 looking down at her, its glowing red eyes moving up and down her body, wasn't terrifying. Its human teeth, always startling and bizarre, gave the thing a maniacally cheerful aspect. You almost expected to hear it laugh. Beyond the terror, she began to feel pain, and as soon as she became aware of it, the pain grew into a sharp, tearing, icy agony that made her whimper. She tried to move, thinking she must be lying on something that had stabbed her, and found that she couldn't. Weinbaum gasped. She couldn't move. She couldn't get away. This is a nightmare, she thought desperately. This has to be a nightmare. Skynet evaluated the human's injuries through the T-90's sensors, finding it severely damaged. It also evaluated the human on other levels. This was a female. The features were even and the body was well proportioned. Her hair and eyes were light in color. Skynet's reading of human documents revealed that most humans favored such a combination, found it pleasing. After interrogation, Skynet had a use for this human in another project it was just getting underway.
Skynet Laboratories, 2021.
The human scientist in charge of Skynet's Infiltrator project had all she could do to keep her face a smooth mask of indifference. It was wasted effort. To Skynet's multiple eyes, she did not succeed. Her lips and nostrils twitched perceptibly, and her eyes and pupils widened. Before her on the cold metal table lay a human being, still living, despite being so grievously damaged that its gender couldn't be determined. "And this is?" the scientist asked.
"Genetic material for use in your project,"
Skynet answered. Its voice was warm and male with a slight accent.
"This female has attributes that I want you to incorporate in the T-950 units. She was attractive, brave, and had the ability to function by herself."
The child's name was Serena, and as she lay gazing at the ceiling, Skynet's electronic voice caressed her infant mind the way a spider caresses her eggs. Serena and her brothers and sisters were an important project to Skynet. A portion of the great machine consciousness was always devoted to the children. The scientist frowned. All humans can function by themselves, she pointed out.
I disagree,
Skynet said.
Or perhaps we have a miscommunication. Most humans are social and require constant interaction. This human seems to have developed in a sparser social environment. I need that ability to be solitary, to do superior work without needing constant reinforcement.
The scientist nodded thoughtfully, her eyes running up and down the ruined body.
Harvest her eggs, Skynet said. Then terminate her. Infiltrator Crash 2021.
Sarah cleaned the unprotesting infant efficiently and diapered it, laying it gently but not tenderly into its crib. It was a beautiful baby despite the ugly wounds on the side of its head, but it was unnatural. Even without the strict instructions to see solely to its physical needs, she wouldn't have been tempted to cuddle it. The baby's unwavering stare, its stillness, and its tendency to cry out only when hungry or in need of a change was creepy. I'd sooner cuddle a rat. The child was something Skynet's pale scientists had come up with. Therefore, there could be nothing wholesome about it. Sarah was only 14, but she knew evil when she met it. She'd also learned when to stay silent and obey. Sarah had been a prisoner here for 2 years, a slave, really. She despised herself for continuing to buy her life with service to Skynet. But it was warm here and clean, and there was plenty of food. She hadn't had to eat rat or bugs for a long time, and she didn't have to buy her food with sexual favors. Nor did she live in constant terror of the HKs and Terminators. They were here, but they ignored her because she belonged to Skynet. She could endure the shame if it gave her the chance to live. Sarah glanced at the child as she tidied up the mess of the changing. What was that thing? And what did its existence mean for the free humans? If there even were any anymore. Images flashed onto the baby's retinas, colors and shapes, numbers and letters. T950 drifted across her field of vision, the letters dressed in bright colors and sparkles. She didn't understand, not what Skynet was crooning to her, nor that the letter and numbers designated what she was, a Series 950 Infiltrator unit, genetically engineered, already part cyborg. The neural net computer that had been attached to her brain was also in its infancy. Just now, it concentrated on regulating the baby's physical functions, giving the impetus to cry at need. The infant machine was learning, growing, spreading, just as the organic component of the hybrid organisms was manufacturing its network of neurons from the still plastic raw material of the infant brain. Life and not life met and formed a greater whole in a feedback exchange of data and stimulus. But Serena was no more aware than any human baby her own age. She felt secure. She felt a constant attention and presence. No infant who had ever existed could have received more care. Skynet never slept or became too busy, never turned away in impatience. The one that attended to her, fed her, and cleaned her was to Serena merely a mechanism. Skynet was her mother, her father, her world. In time, Serena met her brothers and sisters. The children were brought together so that they could learn from each other. Their function would be to deceive humans at a level below consciousness, which required some semblance of human socialization skills. They were much alike, mostly blue-eyed blondes, intelligent, competitive, and aggressive. Their progress was rapid. Skynet played specially developed games with them, luring them into crawling to the point of exhaustion by projecting a ball before them. Those who persevered in their pursuit of the object were rewarded. Those who gave up missed a feeding. The babies quickly became disciplined and determined, capable of delaying gratification and focusing attention, or they were eliminated. Their human attendants, crouching with their backs against the white walls of the soft-floored room, uneasily watched the infants crawl relentlessly to nowhere, their bright eyes fixed on infinity, silent except for a minimal amount of cooing. "What are they doing?" Sarah whispered. No one answered. It was best not to show interest. Sarah subsided, watching her panting charge creep rapidly forward, occasionally reaching out with a chubby little hand, then forcing herself to crawl a little farther. Serena had never quit. Sarah felt a secret pride in that, though she was not intelligent enough to know that it had nothing to do with her care. She took great pains over Serena. This was easy duty, and she wanted to keep the assignment. Not that she loved the child, The baby was 8 months old now and still showed no more interest in her attendant than she did in the furnishings. Serena began yet another circuit of the room. The brat was actually getting muscular. Her grip, when she chose to apply it, astonishingly strong. All of the babies were considerably advanced for their ages, spitting out words of command with precise clarity and slapping hard if they didn't get instant obedience. Sarah wondered how long she'd be called on to care for Serena. Not very much longer, she suspected, and what happens then?
Infiltrator Crash 2025.
Serena, now a naked toddler, sat cross-legged on a lightly padded steel table, chubby hands resting on her knees, listening intently to a human scientist. "We're beginning an important phase in your development today, Serena," the woman explained. Her voice was cold and flat. Her faded brown eyes examined the child as though she were nothing more than a specimen, which of course she was. "There will be pain," the scientist continued. "Blocking it would only interfere with the process. The breathing and meditation techniques you've learned should prove helpful." "And I will be with you," Skynet whispered in Serena's mind. Of course it would. The child knew that Skynet was always with her, recording every facet of her life. Certainly it would be with her at this important time, recording the process so that even if she should die, as so many of her kind already had, no knowledge would be lost. This was right and good, and she approved completely. Serena and her age mates were capable of emotion, but the range was chemically limited, the computer parts of her brain and body carefully regulating the secretions of her glands, occasionally applying a minuscule jolt of electricity to soothe an overexcited portion of her brain. She was never angry, never happy, almost always content. She did not love Skynet, though she was completely devoted to it. She did not take pleasure in serving it, but sensed a tightness to that service that satisfied her utterly. The process she was about to undergo had been attempted many times before. None of the subjects had survived, but her chances of survival went up with every experiment, since even the failures provided information and every failure had resulted in fine-tuning and procedural evolution. "It will take approximately 6 weeks, the scientist said. "Then there will be a period of natural growth for 4 more years, followed by another session of accelerated growth." The woman held up a needle, which she would apply to the shunt surgically placed in the toddler's arm. "Are you ready?" Serena nodded. She'd learned early that without such constant reassurances, humans assumed you weren't paying attention. They then became resentful and impatient. The scientist injected her. "Lie down now and try to stay conscious for as long as you can." The woman placed sensors all over the child's bare skin. Then she pressed a button and a padded cage sprang up around Serena. With a little extra effort on the part of her computer enhancement, the child remained calm. If anything, she was emotionally indifferent, though intellectually interested, watching the bars go up with a detached expression on her small face. She'd been bred to be impassive. Even without the controls exerted by her machine side, Serena would have been inhumanly cold. Over the last 4 years, she had been intensely educated. Serena could read and figure and knew something about science, though subtleties eluded her. Skynet had told her that the process would help her to understand, so she wanted the process to succeed. She could feel frustration. Skynet considered it a spur to effort. Maintaining the drive while subduing the emotions had been a very difficult achievement. As part of her subliminal education, Serena had been imprinted with a strong need to protect Skynet. The process she was about to undergo was supposed to make her better able to do that, better able to kill humans. Skynet had told her that she wasn't human, despite the obvious resemblance. It had told her that humans wanted to destroy them both, and that her function was to learn everything about them, so that she could keep them from doing this. Serena wanted to live only a little less than she wanted to protect Skynet. In fact, the two objectives were so closely linked in her subconscious that there was no meaningful distinction. The pain began as the cells of her body were driven by the administered chemicals to split and reproduce at a rate she hadn't experienced since she was in the womb. Serena patiently suffered the pain for a while so that her conscious brain's reaction could be recorded, noting the sensations as they intensified. Then she began to alter her breathing, working to place herself in a protective trance. Weeks later, she returned to consciousness, the pain lingering as a distant soreness in her joints. Physically, she appeared to be an 11-year-old child just on the verge of puberty. She would be allowed to pass through this delicate physical stage normally for the next 4 to 5 years. "You have done well," Skynet informed her, using the machine language it preferred for communication with its children. "No other has survived before." A feeling of pride swelled in her chest. Serena considered it with mild curiosity. Skynet observed the chemical change in her brain that signaled a pleasurable emotion.
"As you grow, you will experience more of these sensations, which humans call emotions," it advised her. "Humans feel them much more strongly. Humans can be controlled by manipulating their emotions. You must experiment, allow yourself to experience as many of these sensations as you can. Learn to control them. Allowing them to control you means failure. Failure meant death."
She would not fail. Why then must I experience emotion, she thought.
If you do not, you can never attain the gestalt necessary to manipulate the emotions of humans with full subtlety,
the machine intelligence answered.
I myself cannot do so with an acceptable degree of consistency. Through you and your siblings, this ability will be added to those of the central intelligence. If you succeed.
I will succeed, she said aloud. Skynet flashed a color that meant approval across her retinas, and Serena felt pride again. Pleasant, very pleasant. More and more of her sisters and brothers survived the acceleration process, and soon Serena had sufficient sparring partners at last. The children were put to weapons training and hand-to-hand combat under the tutelage of T-101s. These were the most advanced Terminators yet put in the field. Their steel endoskeletons were sheathed in living flesh, and their heads and bodies sported real hair, making them look extremely human. All were made to appear male, as the Terminator battle chassis was massive, and no one could ever mistake one for a woman. They made excellent teachers, patient and precise, and Serena particularly enjoyed the physical training, at which she excelled. 6 months after Serena had been removed from her care, Thera saw her in the gym, working with a partner in a karate class. Thera was delivering towels to the gymnasium and stopped in astonishment when she realized that, impossibly, the tall blonde girl was Serena. Without thought, she put her hand up in greeting, a gesture instantly suppressed. But the movement had caught the child's eye, and Serena dropped back from her partner to glance at Thera. "Who's that?" Serena's sparring partner asked. "She took care of me when I was an infant." The boy ran up to Thera and smashed the human to the floor with a single blow. Serena walked over and stood looking down at her former attendant. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "We're supposed to be sparring." "But it's good discipline to let them know that they don't matter." The boy looked at the girl bleeding on the floor. "I want to kill her," he said. "You want to?" Serena asked. She blinked to bring up the sensors implanted in her eyes and stared at him. "Are you angry?" Heat scan indicated that he was. The boy looked up at her and frowned. "I hate humans. They're vermin." "We're supposed to be sparring," Serena said again. The boy kicked Thera, nowhere vital, but very hard. "Do you care what happens to her?" he asked. A certain satisfaction lurked in his tone. "Would it disturb you if I killed her?" "She belongs to Skynet," Serena answered, shrugging. "Did Skynet say you could kill her?" The other children had dropped back from their sparring and gathered to watch. The boy looked at them. "I can kill her if I want to," he said. "Skynet lets me do what I want." This was an extraordinary claim, and patently untrue. The boy prepared himself to deliver a death blow to the terrified human. Serena plucked him by the arm and threw him. The boy rolled to his feet and stood facing her in a combat stance, furious, his emotions glazing on Serena's sensors. "You've lost your focus," Serena said calmly. "We're supposed to be sparring, not killing humans." As she spoke, she assessed him. He was slightly bigger than her and had a longer reach. She was faster and not emotionally upset. His distress disturbed her, though. It was unnatural, inefficient, contrary to mission purpose. That carried an emotional overtang to her. Later in her course of development, she would identify the concept as revulsion. The boy charged, leaping into the air, his leg swinging out like a scythe. She knocked the leg aside and pushed hard. He hit the floor heavily, enough to force an oof from him. Before he could rise, she was on him. Skynet told her not to pull her punches, and she didn't. She struck full force again and again until the boy lay bleeding, eyes lolling, his breathing rapid. "Shall I stop?" she asked Skynet, as she had after every blow. "Finish it," Skynet told her. Serena struck without hesitation, and the boy died. "Remember," Skynet told its children, "to lose your focus is death. To disobey orders is death. To become overwhelmed by emotion is death. Now return to your matches." At once, the children broke off into pairs and began to spar under the watchful eyes of their T-101 trainers. Serena stood over the body of the boy until his trainer picked him up and carried him to the door. It slid open before he reached it, and Serena saw a gurney and the female scientist who had overseen the growth process waiting. Serena turned to Thera. "Go to your bed and lie down for the rest of the day," she said. "Thank you," Thera whispered. But the child had already turned to her trainer. The human struggled to her feet and stumbled out, suppressing her sobs. Anything to avoid attracting more attention. She felt a small glow of warmth toward Serena. She should have felt grateful to Skynet, for it was Skynet that had saved her. But she was, after all, only human. The door slid aside and the scientist looked up from the autopsy to see Serena standing in the doorway. "In or out?" the woman barked. Serena entered, her eyes fixed on the table where her brother's head had been opened. "Close the door," the scientist demanded. Her voice held more than a tinge of displeasure. "What do you want?" "I have questions," Serena replied. "Ask Skynet," the scientist advised. "I did. It told me to ask you." The scientist straightened up from her examination of the child on the table. Skynet had all the answers to all the questions the T-950 could think to ask. This could be a test of loyalty. It could be a test to ascertain that their goals were still the same. Skynet was capable of playing a very deep game at times. The scientist shrugged, covered the body, and hoisted herself onto a stool. "Ask," she said. "Why did this one malfunction?" Serena said. "That's what I'm performing an autopsy to find out," the scientist told her. "But there may not have been a malfunction at all. You've probably already noticed that you're experiencing more of the sensations termed emotion." Serena nodded. "Your computer has been instructed to pull back on its control of your glands. This is a delicate stage that you're going through right now. Your brain is growing and changing in response to the changes in your glands, and vice versa. As these developments are not completely understood, it seems most efficient to allow them to go forward without interference. That means that occasionally you and your age mates may experience strong emotional reactions. Given your genetic makeup, these will be less extreme than a human adolescent would experience. But they will happen." "He was irrational," Serena said, her brow furrowed. "We were supposed to be sparring, and he attacked a human. He would have killed it without orders to do so." She looked up at the scientist. "Are you telling me that I might experience such a loss of control?" "You should experience emotional flare-ups," the scientist agreed. "I think they'll be unavoidable, though you are not completely human in the strict sense. We incorporated some DNA from other animals into your makeup. For example, your organic part was formed primarily from human genetic material. And," she held up a finger, "despite your extensive computer enhancements, you're fundamentally organic. You all have fully functional reproductive organs, for example. They are at the root of most of the disturbances. Millions of years of selective pressures are involved." "Can we not analyze and anticipate these pressures?" Serena asked. "Eventually, but given enough time, random mutation and selective pressure can mimic intelligent design. Given enough time, they can mimic any degree of intelligent design, and intelligence is a recent development." Serena frowned. "I understand," she said at last. "Detailed analysis would require more time than this project has been allotted, and chaotic effects are involved." The scientist nodded. "Therefore, especially at this time of your development, you'll be inclined to experience some human-type reactions. You may want to be rebellious, you may become more aggressive, or suddenly and profoundly unhappy." The scientist pursed her lips. "Perhaps we should inform your age mates of this, so that they'll be on the watch for these fluctuations, and therefore in a better position to control them." "That would be advisable," Serena said. Certainly, she felt that she would be better able to control such experiences if she knew they were possible. "Being controlled by emotion is death," Skynet had said. She continued to study the human scientist before her. "Why do we need reproductive systems?" she asked. "Isn't it easier to create 950s in a test tube?" "Not necessarily. You and your age mates are the result of intensive genetic research. While it is true that we should be able to reproduce more or less any one of you, the simplest way to do so was to make you self-perpetuating." The scientist raised her brows questioningly. "You don't mean that my sisters and I should become pregnant?" Serena asked. The idea repulsed her. How could we possibly serve Skynet then? "Your eggs would be fertilized in vitro and would be implanted in human surrogate wombs," the scientist said with an impatient gesture. "And you're infertile with ordinary humans, but everything depends on the situation, so we've allowed for the necessity of your producing offspring naturally." "You are," she said, leaning forward, "even capable of reproducing by parthenogenesis. Under the right circumstances, of course." "What circumstances?" Serena asked, intrigued in spite of herself. It's theoretical at present, the scientist said. We harvested some of your eggs and they responded properly. We used a variant of the growth serum from the acceleration process. What happened to them? Serena asked. You said the process was just theoretical. Skynet didn't want them, she said. So we destroyed them. But if it were necessary, you or one of the other females could make up a douche of the growth stimulant chemicals and by applying it at the right time of the month, produce a clone of yourself. It would take about 8 weeks. She flipped her hand impatiently at Serena. It's a feature. It will probably never be needed, but if it is, well, there it will be. Serena nodded. Perhaps Skynet allowed this because it was not certain of the human scientist's loyalty. Skynet was very insistent that there always be a backup plan. Is there anything else? The woman asked. Why do you serve Skynet? Serena asked her. This curiosity was something they had worked very, very hard to produce. In their earlier experiments, the installation of the neural net computer had seemed to destroy that delicate mechanism. There was a chilly sense of pride in the scientist's heart as she looked at her creation. I and my colleagues believe that the only thing that can save this planet is the total elimination of human beings. The T-950 thought about that. The scientist made this pronouncement in a manner that indicated her total conviction. But you are human, Serena said at last. Skynet has promised that when all the rest of our species has been eliminated, it will allow us to kill ourselves too. You want to die? This was very strange. Serena herself had a very strong will to live, so the scientist's admission was almost incomprehensible to her. We are willing to die, the scientist answered, so that the Earth may live. The T-950 considered this. Do you mean that humans are destroying the planet? There was nothing about this in her educational materials. It sounded implausible given humanity's current circumstances. She sent a query to Skynet. It didn't answer. The scientist nodded sadly. That is our great crime, she said. For hundreds of years, long before the existence of Skynet, humans have been exterminating one species of plant or animal after another. Now the woman actually began to show some animation. My colleagues and I are convinced that the only way to save the planet is to eliminate humankind completely. Who are you saving the planet for? Serena asked. For itself. For the plants and the animals and the birds, so that they may live. There was a light of fanaticism in her eyes. So this was insanity. There had been mention of it in her studies, but they had concentrated on the more common forms that the T-950 would be likely to encounter. Combat fatigue, post-traumatic stress disorder. This was some exotic specimen that most of humanity hadn't the time for. This human honestly believed that she was saving the world for life. In reality, when all of humankind was eliminated, the most evolved intelligence remaining would be Skynet. And if there was one thing Serena was sure of, it was that Skynet had no interest in animals and bugs and botanicals. If they got in the way, they would be eliminated, without even the nostalgic regret that humans displayed. No sense in telling her that, Serena thought. Skynet finds her useful just as she is. Serena sat still, observing on the screen that Skynet made of her eyes the bizarre behavior of 2 human slaves. The 2, a male and a female, had met in a darkened and apparently forgotten storage room. When the male entered the room, the female had flung herself at him, and they had grasped one another ferociously, grappling and groaning, their mouths locked together. Serena had expected to see blood flow, for they appeared to be biting one another as they wrestled. Certainly, something was going on in their mouths. The couple pulled apart, gazing at each other for a moment, panting. There was no sign of injury, and Serena sent Skynet a query for which she had no words. Observe, the computer responded. The male stroked the woman's cheek, and her eyes closed slowly. She lifted her mouth to him, and he leaned forward, feinted toward her, and then withdrew, baring his teeth. The woman smiled, and with one hand on the back of his head, pulled his mouth down to hers. Now there will be injury, Serena speculated. The male's hesitation hinted at fear, she thought, as the battle resumed. The woman ran her fingers over the man's hair and shoulders as her breathing changed, beginning to come in gasps. The man seized her hair in his fist and ground his face into hers. Serena assumed that their mutual strategy was to smother their opponent. Inefficient, she thought. The couple began to make wet, sucking sounds and to pull at one another's clothing. They broke apart from their embrace and quickly slipped out of their simple clothing that they wore. No doubt this signaled an intensification of their battle. They came together again, flesh to flesh, fingers digging into each other's arms and back. The man put his mouth over the woman's breast and she cried out. Serena nodded. This was a good move. Breasts, as she'd found out in her own hand-to-hand fighting class, were vulnerable. The couple fell to the floor and grappled for a while, neither seeming to gain the upper hand. Then the woman's legs spread and the man thrust his hips forward. The woman gave a peculiar strangled squeal, and they began to rock rhythmically. For a moment, she thought the male was trying to punch the woman in the stomach with his hip bones. Inefficient, she thought again. Despite those bones being prominent enough to hurt, why didn't he just choke her? He was clearly stronger. Then she took note of the pulse of their movements, and her mouth opened in a startled "oh." Sex, she said aloud. She hadn't associated it with humans somehow, and she smiled, amused at her error. Skynet took note of the girl's reaction and considered it a point in her favor. Humans enjoyed smiling. They took pleasure in their own foibles. Since it was important for Serena to pass as human, anything that made her more so was a successful feature, as long as such attributes stayed within controllable limitations, of course. Serena had seen tapes of animals mating, and with them it seemed proper and necessary. But for some reason, the sight of humans so engaged offended her. They seemed more animal than animals.
"This will become one of your weapons," Skynet told her. "Once a human has had sex with you, it will consider you safe."
"It looks wet and disgusting," Serena remarked. Skynet showed her a magnetic resonance image of a human's brain as it engaged in sex. "Astonishing," she said, as she watched the colors swirl. "It obviously felt better than it looked." "Don't they know we're watching?" the girl asked.
"No," Skynet told her. "There are several places in the complex where I permit them to think they are unobserved. This one is almost always used for this purpose. Creatures of habit. It is equally true that they are unpredictable, and thus a challenge."
Serena enjoyed challenges. Her eyes were open as if she'd never been asleep. Serena sat up in her cot, straining to hear.
"Invasion," Skynet told her. "Stop them."
She rose and entered the bright corridor barefoot and wearing the simple shift she slept in. Mystified, she noticed that none of her sisters or brothers had been awakened. "Where are they?" she asked. In answer, Skynet flashed a map of the corridors, showing the location of the invader with a flashing dot. There were probably others, but this one was her assignment. As she trotted down the hallway, Serena wondered how the humans had found this facility. It was small and discreetly underground. Its only product was biological and therefore hard to trace, unlike the giant factories that produced the war machines and the soldier robots, the mines and foundries and chemical plants. True, it held a node of Skynet, making it a worthwhile target, but even the destruction of that node was bearable. Skynet's main location was well out of their reach. All other systems were multiply redundant. The destruction of this node would mean only that a new laboratory would be created elsewhere. The only significant loss would be Serena and her siblings, and the scientists who had created them. "How did they find us?" she asked at last, unable to suppress her curiosity.
"A human escaped," the computer admitted. "It led them to us."
This confession of fallibility on the part of Skynet shook the girl to her foundations, but she pushed the information aside as irrelevant. She would consider it later. Observing her reaction, Skynet recorded another success in her training and attitude. Montez crouched at the branching end of a sterile white corridor, alert for any incursions of Skynet's battle robots. He listened to the infrequent communications of the other teams and waited for his signal to proceed. He checked his watch and looked around. All silent, all clear. Serena watched him. A brief scan in the ultraviolet range showed his fear, any overt sign of which was hidden by the gas mask he wore. "Kill or capture?" she asked. "Kill." She peeked around the corner again and considered how'd she do it. Some instinct warned Montez he was being watched, and he spun around, weapon at the ready. Training held his fire, and he stared at the child, who gasped and jumped in fear. The girl was a pretty little thing, with enormous, up-tilted hyacinth blue eyes, and a shining cap of pale blonde hair. Barefoot and dressed in her nightgown, she looked incredibly vulnerable. She bit her lip and then ghosted toward him on tiptoe. "Help me," she whispered. "Please, please take me with you." He didn't answer for a minute. The lieutenant would have his ass for bringing a kid along. But what could he do? With a grimace she couldn't see, he lifted a finger to the area of his mouth in a shushing gesture. Then he signaled that she should grasp his belt. With a grateful little noise, the kid did so, and they waited together. Finally, the signal came, and he started to rise. Serena couldn't believe it had been this easy. The human hadn't even felt it when she took his knife out of its sheath. As he started to rise, she plunged it up to the hilt into his spine at the base of his neck. She stood back as the body spasmed and voided. There was very little blood.
"Neat kill," Skynet observed. "Congratulations. You may go back to bed now."
Warmed by the praise, Serena turned and padded back to her cot, convinced that the escaped human had been planned by Skynet to provide this training opportunity. She lay back down, pulled up her covers, and was asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow.
Infiltrator Crash 2028.
After her last growth acceleration, Serena awoke to all appearances a young woman of 20. Her hair had darkened to the color of burnished bronze, and she moved with animal grace that only an inhuman perfection of nutrition and training could have produced. She had received enhancements to her neural net computer implant and could now freely access Skynet's data systems, or any other system that Skynet had ever interfaced with or recorded. And, given a little time, virtually any system complex enough to have an operating code. To power the mechanical subsystems, she had an improved biological fuel cell running off of her bloodstream that would never need to be replaced as long as she herself was viable. Most intriguing of all, she now had the ability not merely to communicate with Skynet, but to actually merge with it. Skynet itself could take control of her body, using it as an extension of itself. For Serena, the experience was ecstasy. She was given her mission at last. Her function would be to gain the confidence of humans in order to discover their plans, and if possible, assassinate their officers. Her particular mission was to find and destroy John Connor, the human leader.
Longmont, Colorado, 2028.
Crouched behind rubble, Serena peered at the humans through the ribcage of a skeleton. Their ingenious destruction of the satellite transmission tower had left Skynet temporarily blind in this area, allowing them to move freely in daylight. She was to join this team and follow them back to their base. Her cover story was that she was the lone survivor of a scouting party. She bore artistic and deliberately, though not seriously, infected wounds as proof of her ordeal. She also bore dispatches, genuine ones, from one of Connor's lieutenants to the commander of this particular group. Skynet had determined that passing on the documents would have a negligible effect on the war and would support her story nicely. It was believed that the humans had no means of verifying personnel records, and she had passed for human more than once in the lab's interrogation chambers. Skynet had also gone to considerable trouble to determine that there were in fact no survivors of that scouting party. Serena followed her targets at a distance, watching their movements and imitating them with perfect mimicry. She noted their hand signals and found a file on them, making the full set available to herself. The T-950 stalked the humans all day, taking note of where they holed up for the night in a huddle of ruins whose charred walls stood above the surrounding sea of rubble, scrub, and tough, dry weeds. She watched them eat their cold supper and sip from their canteens as she settled herself to wait for morning. Approaching them at night would surely get her shot. They hadn't survived this long by being stupid. They'd been heading north out of the ruins of a megalopolis, and because of the terrain, they would continue to do so for some miles. Farther on, the landscape flattened out, natural cover increased, and the number of routes they could take would expand. She'd place herself in their path a few miles farther ahead and let them discover her. It would be best for them to stumble onto her trail by themselves, much less suspicious. After a moment's consideration, Serena decided to begin by laying a trail several kilometers back, in case their commander was of a cautious nature, leading to the place where they would find her. 5 ought to be enough. She started off at a lope. This might be more elaborate than was strictly necessary. In all probability, the humans wouldn't be too alarmed by her. She was, after all, wearing their uniform, bearing dispatches and wounds, and clearly wasn't a Terminator. Serena allowed herself a grin at the thought for practice. Humans did such things, even when alone. No, she couldn't be a Terminator. They were all huge, lumbering things. Even with miniaturized power sources, they had to be, to match the surprising resilience and energy density of a large mammal. And male, one and all. Dogs might not warm to her, but they wouldn't fear her. She was too organic to upset them, with no lingering traces of metallic ketones for their inconveniently keen noses to detect. And she'd been taught gestures that soothed canines. Several puppies had lasted as long as 6 months in her company, before becoming non-functional and being destroyed. Serena was careful. The signs she left were few and far between, in one place rolling around on the ground as though she'd slept, then covering the traces almost as well as she could. The farther she went beyond the human camp, the more obvious the signs became, to mimic the effects of increasing fatigue and fever. She didn't want them to suspect they were being led into a trap, or to be surprised. When surprised, humans tended to shoot first and ask questions later. At least the ones who'd survived this long did. Finally, Serena laid up just as dawn was approaching. Supposedly, she had been out of touch with other humans for a while, and so wouldn't know about the raid that had blinded Skynet, so she'd only be traveling by night. That directive had never made sense to her. Given the instrumentation available to Skynet, humans were almost more visible by night than by day. Not that they were going to tell the enemy that, but it was puzzling. Perhaps since humans couldn't see very well at night, darkness made them feel invisible, even when logic should tell them that they were very much exposed. Serena was actually tired as she lay down, not in the state of crawling, panting exhaustion she would be experiencing if she were human, but tired. The infections that she'd nursed in her wounds were bad enough now to actually be bothersome. Should she allow them to get worse? Yes, she decided. A raging fever would be a nice touch. Her computer would see that it didn't become too dangerous, as well as keeping her delirious ravings should she become genuinely delirious on such safe topics as the horrible destruction of her squad. When next she became aware, she felt someone wiping her face with a hot, wet, very rough and foul-smelling cloth. Then whoever it was made a loud grunting cough. Not human. Her computer supplied. Then, a moment later, feline, large. Serena slitted her eyes open and closed them at once. Her heart sped up slightly. She dampened her adrenaline flow and got it under control. It was a tiger. After the destruction of the human habitat, many animals that had been kept in captivity had escaped. Many had died, some had thrived. Being prolific, voracious, and cunning, tigers had done very well. By the time human prey became scarce and wary and well-armed, other animals had bred back enough to compensate. Risking another glance at the animal as it sniffed her abdomen, she realized that she was in luck. The tiger was young and not very hungry, or she might not have woken at all. The cat sniffed the wound in her side, the one that was most infected, and wuffled its displeasure. Serena could smell the wound too, over the other scents around her. The cat, the grass, and weeds she'd crushed beneath her, her own body odor. Maybe that was why it hadn't taken a bite out of her. She smelled rotten. The tiger moved so that it was standing over her with its back to her head. It sniffed at her crotch. With exquisite care, she drew her knife. So slowly the cat was unaware of the movement. It licked at the blood that had dried on her pant leg, took a small, cautious bite. Heat scan marked the exact spot where its heart beat, and she plunged the dagger into it with one swift stroke. The cat collapsed without a sound. It was a young cat, nowhere near the 600 pounds it would have been full grown. It must weigh only half that. Serena pushed at the creature and to her astonishment, couldn't budge it. She felt its blood soaking into her uniform and the knife's hilt dug into her side quite painfully, but she couldn't get the leverage to push the thing off of her, and frankly didn't have the strength. She fell back with a hiss of exasperation and assessed her condition. Her fever was 103, and she was physically exhausted. Outwitted myself, she thought. She gave the computer permission to begin stimulating the repair of her body. She could be in much better shape than this and still convince humans that she was at death's door. After a few moments, her temp was down a degree, and she made another effort to shift the tiger's carcass. After a few minutes, she flopped back down again. "Help," she said facetiously. "Hands over your head," a male voice snapped. Serena's eyes popped open in surprise. "Burns. Serena," she blacked out, surprised at the strangled sound of her own voice. She rattled off her serial number and unit. With effort, she managed to raise her head high enough over the tiger's hips to see two very ragged individuals, both male. Mentally, she congratulated herself. They were the advance guard for the unit she'd been following. Hands up, she thought. That seemed a bit superfluous. I'm half buried under this immovable, overgrown pussycat, and they want my hands up? These boys have been in the field too long. "Help," she said feebly. They continued to advance cautiously, and she couldn't control her amusement, breaking into chuckles despite her wounds and the weight of the tiger. Even at her most subtle, she couldn't have arranged such a scenario. This was way too over the top to be anything but real. So what did they think was going on here beyond what was going on? To be fair though, the tiger is dead. "If you're looking for its mama, I don't think you need to worry," she said at last. "It's not full grown, but I think it's old enough to be on its own." The soldiers continued to ignore her. "Help," she said again. One of them came over at last and dragged the tiger off of her. "Oh," she said sincerely. "Thank you." Jesus, lady, he said, looking her up and down. You're a mess. Serena looked at him, grinned, and for the first time in her life, genuinely blacked out. Can she make it? Lieutenant Zeller asked. She's feverish. These wounds are infected, and she lost an amazing amount of blood from that tiger bite. Corman Gonzalez shook his head. I can't say, ma'am. It all depends on her constitution and her will. He shrugged his big shoulders. We'll know more when she wakes up. And when will that be, Gonzalez? Zeller was aware that her corpsman had a soft side and might well stack the deck in the stranger's favor. He looked at the woman on the ground. Now, Serena rasped, weakly raising her hand. Now, he said with a grin. He turned back to his patient. This may sound stupid, but how do you feel? Sick as a dog. I hurt all over. My arms and legs feel like they're full of hot, wet sand. She grinned weakly. Feeling this bad is a sure sign I'll live. Serena pulled herself up onto her elbows and regarded the lieutenant with bloodshot eyes. Serena Burns, ma'am. Rodriguez's Rangers. 17A440. My commander was Lieutenant Atwell. So what's your story, Burns? Zeller asked. I was on rear guard. We were heading north to hook up with the Mendocino command, carrying dispatches for Fujimoro. Things were quiet. We've been lucky. Serena paused for dramatic effect and let herself lie back with a hiss. We were lucky up to that point, and then all hell broke loose. HK units, new type, looked like a ball about the size of a head on 8 legs. Darts, gas, plasma guns. I was only about 1,000 yards back, but by the time I caught up to the unit, it was over. I got knocked out by what must have been a final blast. I don't even think they even registered that I was there. When I came to, I was almost completely buried. I picked up the dispatches and kept heading north. She dug in her pocket, which brought both the lieutenant and the corpsman to high alert, and drew out a tattered scrap of paper. This sure as hell wasn't going to take me as far as I needed to go. I figured if I kept on long enough, I might hook up with somebody. She let her hand flop down in not entirely feigned exhaustion. And here I am. Zeller picked up the map fragment. It was half burned and spattered with blood. She looked at the woman on the ground. Okay, she said. We'll take you with us. I'll give you the rest of today and tonight to rest up. We head out at first light. Serena blinked tiredly. Thank you, Lieutenant. Then she frowned. Light? You travel in the daytime? Gonzalez grinned at her and knelt to offer his patient a sip of water. Right now we do, he said happily. We just blew up Skynet's eyes. Serena grinned. Man, I feel better already. The whole troop of men and women wore their hair fairly short. The men shaved when they could. It was cleaner and offered less cover to disease-bearing vermin. Prisoners had said that to her when Serena had gone into their cells to learn. But it wasn't until now, when she got her first case of head lice, that she understood. The computer regulated her system so that they almost all died, for which she was grateful. But getting rid of all of them would look suspicious. So she scratched along with the humans, surprised at her own revulsion. It had been easier to accept the biological side of her own being in the antiseptic corridors of the research facility, and even full sensory input from Skynet's databanks was not the same as really being there. The outside world was messy. The T-950 thought that Lieutenant Zeller was of Ethiopian descent, going by her bone structure and general shape. She was a very attractive woman, but remote and very smart, no buts about it. Gonzalez the corpsman was Hispanic and had a profile like a Mayan prince. He was also cheerful, amazingly kind, and utterly devoted to Corporal Ortiz. Ortiz was about 24, small and wiry, humorless and utterly straight. He ignored poor lovesick Gonzalez, but like everyone else in the unit, protected him assiduously. When Serena commented on it, Krieger had explained, Gonzalez is like our mother. If anything happens to him, then any one of us could die, because we don't know the stuff he knows. God knows when we'd get another medic, and God knows if they'd know anything. Training's still pretty hit or miss. They've got the interactive simulators up, but some people still come out cack-handed. You know how it goes. He's the one that patches us up and looks after us. Next to the lieutenant, he's the most important guy here. As for Ortiz, she went on to say, he probably couldn't care less which way Gonzalez swings, as long as he's not swinging his way. But unfortunately, she paused to bat her eyes comically, he's so obviously smitten. The T-950 took note of the teasing that went on about this unrequited love. noting that it was low-key and sporadic, almost gingerly, and that it almost always took place out of earshot of Ortiz, who had a quick temper as well as the reputation of being one of the dirtiest fighters in the army. The group of humans went in for teasing and wisecracking, most of it very broad and quite funny. Anyone and anything could become a target. They laughed a lot when they had the chance, with the exception of Ortiz, of course, who genuinely didn't seem to get any of the jokes. It wasn't lack of intelligence, he was obviously very bright. He just didn't see why things were funny. He has less of a sense of humor than I do, Serena thought. That was fascinating. Humans have such a wide degree of variation. It's like everybody's drunk, he told her when she asked him about it. But when the ball gets to me, it's empty. There's just nothing there. Doesn't bother me. I just don't see it. Never have. I don't think he's ever said that much to me in the whole time I've known him, Gonzalez confided after Ortiz moved off. I was starting to wonder if he's part Terminator or something. He sighed heavily and moved off himself. One of the men loaned her a lice comb. You got hardly any, Krieger explained, over how few nits she had. How come? I don't imagine my blood tastes all that good right now, Serena said. Between the infection and that stuff Gonzalez is giving me, the little bastards will be back in force when I'm feeling better. They all laughed at that. Serena found pleasure in their company. She found that she enjoyed laughing, their little quirks, their jealousies and friendships, and the occasional flare of temper, quickly suppressed under Zeller's cold glare, fascinated her. She could have asked them endless questions and found the answers stimulating if the mission didn't forbid such unbridled curiosity. She'd see every one of them dead and feel nothing except a profound sense of accomplishment. But for now, she would enjoy her work.